Okay, so welcome to Socialist Alternatives talk on the rise of the far right, Reclaim Australia and Donald Trump. Featuring tonight are such characters such as Donald Trump, who names all Mexicans as rapists and predators, and wants all Muslims banned from the United States, who recently, and let's say unsurprisingly, was also endorsed by a member of the KKK. And members of the KKK have also been attending his rallies. So when asked would he condemn them, he responded that wouldn't it be rather unfair to condemn these people without me doing a bit of research on them first? Of course, Trump would never make sweeping judgments about whole groups of people, least of those who least deserve it, like armed white supremacist thugs. So here at home we haven't been immune to the rise of the far right either, with the rise, fall, splintering, name-calling again, falling out, crying, clinging on of Reclaim Australia and the United Patriots Front. Now the leaders and followers of this movement are such a large and mixed bag, cohered mostly by their racism towards Muslims and hatred of non-whites more generally. Then unlike Donald, it's kind of hard to sum them up in just a single quote. These people range from the outright bizarre, such as a man who's followed the Reclaim rallies around the country, dressed as a tub of Vegemite, begging the company to revoke its halal certification. Seriously, take a moment. Imagine being this man. Nightmare. But they also go down to the downright fascistic. We've got their founder of Reclaim Australia and the UPF, Sherman Burgess, who repeatedly calls for civil war against Muslims and for their expulsion from the country. Unfortunately for us tonight, I have found the perfect quote. It comes from the current leader of the UPF, Blair Cottrell's personal Facebook page called Basic Philosophical Re-Education, which literally has him in the mind-blown pose, so you know it's going to be good. So as usual, life imitates art. And Blair's analysis of the Harry Potter book series, I believe, sums up aptly both the group's fascistic elements as well as a hearty dose of insane. So, if you're not familiar with who Blair Cottrell really is, he's a virulent, he's a Hitler lover, he's a white supremacist, homophobe, misogynist, basically everything under the sun, but he's also an avid roid rager. So I'll try and do the best impression I can. So this is Blair on Harry Potter. Consider the Harry Potter story for a moment. It's actually an interesting representation of our current situation. What's interesting is the seemingly illegitimate basis for Voldemort's whole view. Everything he does and says constantly suggests that he is an evil psychopath with no clear goal other than vengeance and pointless murder. Just a lunatic, a fascist and a racist wizard who doesn't deserve to live, feared and hated by all the educated witches and wizards. Anyone following Voldemort does so out of fear, stupidity, or some other baseless reason. Dumbledore, on the other hand, is frequently portrayed and looked upon in the audience as a genius, a pinnacle of compassion and knowledge. But in reality, the view is that wizards can and should be interbred with muggles must ultimately lead to the squandering of their magical blood, and finally a dying out of wizardry altogether. As there are many more muggles in the world. Yeah, the fucking symbolism there. But wizards and witches, and because there are many more muggles, witches and wizards are already producing children called squibs who are incapable of magic at all. Because they have crossed with muggles to such an extent. The awkward truth of the tale is, Voldemort's view that magical blood ought to be protected and preserved would actually prevent this dying out, and if it were put into practice, would actually strengthen magical lineages, leading to a definite advancement of the wizarding community. Whereas the popular view of multiculturalism, tolerance and interbreeding with muggles can only weaken the blood qualities and lead to an eventual dying out of witchcraft and wizardry altogether. One would assume that the wizarding world is being actively and successfully subverted by proponents of global human equality. So that's Blair's analysis of the Harry Potter book series. And firstly, ignoring the fact that whiteness isn't magical, just more prone to sunburns, did Cottrell actually just compare himself to Wizard Hitler? Or Whistler? So jokes aside for now, seriously. You know why you're here, and that is because the far right, you see the far right as the clear danger that it is. And so to firstly understand racism, to firstly understand the far right, we have to look at a brief history of the two countries. Now, racism is absolutely at the core of both countries and is deeply rooted in the capitalist system in both Australia and America. It is no surprise then that racism and xenophobia are galvanising calls for the followers of the far right. Indeed, both countries required racism to justify invasion and colonisation. How else to convince the population that it was okay to exterminate the local populations and steal their lands without the ideas of racism? Now, racism wasn't just integral to the early colonial projects in each country, it continued on to be the bedrock of ruling class policy ever since. In the US, racism was vital to justify the horrendous brutalities meted out to the slave population in pursuit of profit. In Australia, racism was constantly used to further steal away Indigenous people's land and enact genocidal policies like the Stolen Generation. Racism was also to become the founding document of Australia, that just after Federation, when the White Australia policy was passed, the ruling class's desire to create an ethnically homogenous society in the hopes of binding the Australian population to the ruling class with the existential threat of an Asian invasion. It also helped justify Australia's own colonial empire as it nabbed countries in the Pacific like Fiji and Nauru. Now, this has been a very brief, obviously very brief, account of racism, the racist history of both Australia and America. However, I think it demonstrates how absolutely hand-in-glove racist policies have been for the ruling elites. Whether this is the exploitation of cheap labour, or for the expansion of the empire or the economy. And these policies of racism continue to be used to divide and conquer the working class today. Of course, nowadays the language has changed, but the content of racism really hasn't. No longer are blacks incarcerated en masse because they are inferior, but because they are criminals. And we don't have a white Australia policy anymore. The government just persecutes refugees en masse because they would steal your jobs and welfare, or they don't integrate with our cultural values. The result, however, even with the twangs of liberalism, is the persecution of minorities in the exact same way the state has always done. So then, I think this is a good basis to come from to understand the ideology of the far right then. So they are obsessed and jealous guarders of a mythical national ideal. Think of Trump's constant appeals to make America great again, or bring back the American dream, or make toupees compulsory for all. Or Reclaim's constant evoking of the Anzacs or Ned Kelly. Along with their national ideals comes aggressive control of borders. Trump's own website declares, "A nation with no borders is no longer a nation," with the caption under it, "Make Mexico pay for the wall," and calls for all illegal immigrants to be deported from the United States. The fascists in Reclaim likewise call for refugees to be deported, a freeze on construction of mosques, and for basically a renewal of the White Australia policy. Now, all this builds into their thuggish militarism. Reclaimers and members of the UPF constantly put up videos of themselves working out or in military attire, and they've also put up several videos of other nationalist groups beating up immigrants or left-wing factions. And in one case, they put up a video of a Spanish anti-fascist being stabbed to death, while a member of the UPF watched the video laughing. So while Trump isn't a fascist in the classic sense of the word, his rhetoric has been constantly violent, and we've probably all seen examples of this. So he's called on media, in the media, for the execution of the families of terrorists, which is a blatant war crime. and he constantly encourages his supporters to use violence against Black Lives Matter protesters at his rallies, calling them to be thrown out, to be roughed up, and saying later that they deserved it because what they were doing was disgusting. Similarly, at a Trump rally, normally a sort of group that's protected from violence, a New York Times photographer tried to simply photograph Black Lives Matter protesters, but he was grabbed by the neck and thrown to the ground by Trump's security team. And there have been countless and everyday surfacing videos of supporters taking violent action against protesters at his rallies. And this is only probably likely to continue as more and more people end up protesting Trump. This has even led to Trump putting a call out saying that he would send his own supporters to go and smash up Bernie Sanders' rallies, his socialist rival, in retaliation. To which Bernie Sanders responded, "Send them. Don't they deserve to see an honest politician once in a while?" Feel the burn! Now, the fascists also hark back to strict definitions of gender and gender roles. The UPF put up a video of its own creation, as I mentioned before, about fascists marching around the world, beating up left-wing forces and immigrants, and even included members of the Golden Dawn giving Heil Hitler salutes. The video ends, however, bizarrely, with images of several white women, most of them at football matches cheering their sides, with words like, "What we fight for," and "Men don't die for equality, they die for women." The video was also hilariously captioned by a supporter, "Nationalists of the world unite." I know, it's so irritating. It's like you literally fucking can't. The whole basis of it. But it's like, so stupid. But it's reminiscent of the ideology of the far right that white women need to be protected from hordes of invading blacks. Recently, a fascist flag from Poland put up an image of a woman having her dress torn off with the EU symbol on it by several black hands, entitled "The Rape of Europe," which did the rounds on several fascist sites. Similarly, the UPF have made t-shirts with signs saying "No more rape-fugees in Australia," which is ironic when you consider that the majority of their membership have actually been convicted of domestic violence and sexual assault. So finally, typical of far-right paranoia, they're absolutely obsessed with Marxists, which they think are controlling the country or the entire world. The usual thing is a cultural Marxist plot, as they call it, and the biggest cultural Marxist plot is political correctness, which is normally just code for, I said something really, really, really fucking racist, and they just called me out for it. And I didn't like that. But as a Marxist, I can confirm there's absolutely no plot to take over the country. They normally say that they're just exercising their rights to freedom of speech. However, I think we know in this room that, of course, hate speech isn't free speech. And whenever they show up to have their disgusting rallies, we're going to shut them down because all they want to do is spread hatred and terrify the oppressed. But more on that later. So then what is the far right? It really is the ugliest and most grotesque part of capitalism. They are the personification of the most vile aspects of capitalist ideology. Marx said that the ideas of any epoch are the ideas of its ruling class. They control the education system, the media, and typically all the history books. The capitalist class use this to try and convince us things like competition is natural, that human nature is a blockade to any sort of change, and that racism is typical of the human condition. Now, this bullshit infects every one of us. It lingers on in our minds. We as members of the working class, though, even though we are affected by ruling class ideology, are totally capable of creating a different world and a different ideology. We are capable of things like solidarity. So when through struggle, whether we be fighting for better wages, for political change, or anything else, we have to rely on the people next to us, no matter who they are, whether they be black, white, LGBTIs, refugees, or anything else. Through struggle against crisis, our class, the working class, can create a whole new narrative capable of challenging this whole system. The class that can typically not do this is the middle class. As isolated individuals guarding a small business, their lives are, they feel that their lives are constantly under siege under capitalism. But unlike workers, they cannot fight for change through unions or with solidarity. So they don't have that experience, and so very easily fall prey to the dominant narrative that the ruling class disseminates. By extension, if they find themselves in deep crisis, fascist parties can appear as the only force capable of saving them. Now, what I think will strike anyone so far in my talk is that the demands of the far right are already the policy of the governments in the US and in Australia. In both the US and Australia, refugees are treated with suspicion and governments persecute them. Every day we are exposed to the problem of Islam and its cultural identity as something incompatible with our own Western democracy. There is constant calls from both parties at all times to militarise the borders, and finally we are again called in both countries by both parties at all times to applaud war in the Middle East as if this was somehow humanitarian or for democracy. Or more, as what they used to say, the white man's burden, to use Kipling's famous racist quote. So, do we live under fascism now? Are the fascists already in power? No. But racism continues to remain integral to the capitalist system today. Today, with crisis and dissatisfaction constantly nipping at the heels of the capitalist class, a scapegoat is needed to keep the working class divided and to keep its attention away from its real enemies, the bourgeois. In Australia, for example, productivity is through the roof. We have never been so productive in our entire history. Australia has gone through one of the longest boom periods ever, and yet very little has trickled down to workers. And although we are enormously productive, the share of that income has stayed the same. This hyper-exploitative situation naturally needs a distraction from the point of view of the ruling class. And ever since 2001, particularly after 9/11 and the Tampa affair, where the government launched fears that Australia was at risk of being invaded by fanatical Muslim hordes. Muslims, we were told by both the liberal and conservative press, were so inhuman as to throw their children overboard to get into Australia. So fanatical that suicide bombings could be right around the corner, or so desperate that they would take your job because they'd work for nothing. Media reports applauded the invasion of the Middle East as somehow humanitarian, and for the most part Labor was along for the ride. Just like the White Australia policy of yesteryear, the fear was designed to distract us from our real enemies and make us see our exploiters as our allies against this existential threat. However, by 2007, sympathy was swinging towards refugees, partly as the result of tireless work done by refugee advocates, and it became one of the major reasons for Howard's fall. However, Kevin Rudd did little to change this policy on temporary protection visas, and refugees in detention rose dramatically. By the time Gillard was in power, that is when the ugly race to the bottom had really begun, and plans for offshore detention in Malaysia and other countries like it, as Labor and Liberal attempted to outdo each other in racism and cruelty. This is all with the backdrop of billions being made in the mining sector, attacks on universities and attacks on welfare. It is little wonder then that Labor and Liberal, with little to offer Australians via improved conditions, had to rest heavily on the crutch of racism. However, despite this, Australians actually didn't swallow government racism whole. In 2011, a poll asking Australians what they thought were the most important issues in need of address, asylum seekers came at a distant fourth. This is compared to things like the economy, poverty, and unemployment, as well as political leadership. Now this, I would imagine, was just a little bit fucking annoying for the government, seeing as they'd spent more than a decade whipping up fears of asylum seekers. But today, we have no change whatsoever. Tony might be gone, but Turnbull is still peddling the same old shit. It is clear why the government must keep leaning so much on the crutch of racism. Now that it must be strained to near breaking point, seeing as they are committing horrific atrocities against refugees, the latest one being trying to abduct baby Asha from the Brisbane hospital to deport her. Seriously, you can sort of become numb to it. But what other countries actually convict babies? It's
Hello, I'm Officer PC Barry, speaking on behalf of the Department of Immigration. Now, the Department of Immigration is getting tough on teeny tiny toddler crime. And it has to be said that presuming the innocence of children only gets in the way of swift justice. Now, this is not even close, obviously, to the extent of the barbarities perpetrated against refugees, but to go into it now would obviously be the subject of a whole other talk. But because they have lent so much on the crutch of racism, so it has made the political situation absolutely rife for far-right cranks to get their foot in the door. It has seen the birth of the Australian Liberty Alliance, endorsed by notorious racist and Aryan hair dye enthusiast Geert Wilders. The Alliance's constitution has an absolutely outright pogromist character. So I'll just read from their constitution here. It is our core policy that all attempts to impose Islam's theocracy or Sharia law on our liberal society must be stopped by democratic means before the demographic and socio-political realities make a peaceful solution impossible. So yeah, just an outright call to violence, I think. But of course, this has meant that the cranks in Reclaim Australia have also been able to get their foot in the door as they swim along with the tide of racism and xenophobia. Now, as much as we might laugh at Fiora Blair-Cottrell, he himself has recognised this. Now, Blair, as I said, is a puerile anti-Semite and white supremacist, and he knows that this is as unfashionable as the teeny tiny tank tops that he wears. So their plan has been to keep talking about Muslims, and in the meantime, they are still very sort of, not so much undercover, but they are still virulent anti-Semites, and Blair is still Blair is a well-documented lover of Hitler. So these are, of course, the dangerous ideas loosed by the government's racist agenda, where the respectable ALA can make an allusion to a pogrom in its constitution, and the UPF can lay the groundwork for a neo-Nazi organisation. So on to America now. In America, a very similar but very much more extreme situation exists. Wages and living conditions continue to remain dismal, and while the banks were bailed out to the tune of trillions, millions of Americans have been left on the sidelines. Obama's presidency has done little to nothing to mitigate this. Instead, racism in the US has been ramped up more than ever. Black Americans are still being slaughtered by police, and there is seldom justice for their families. The US border is skirted by more guards and more technology than ever before. Obama has killed more people with drones than any president before him, and the largest prison population in the world resides in America, disproportionately populated by Black and Latino people. When organisations like Black Lives Matter stand up against this kind of system, they are met with batons from the state and derision in the media. And a famous example of this was after the murder of Freddie Gray at the hands of police provoked a riot. The media focused purely on the riot and this one window being broken, and they focused on it so much that it launched the mock hashtag White Windows Matter, because that's clearly the state of things in America. Now, Trump has arisen in this context. Now, Trump has been painted by the media and himself as an outlier candidate, removed from official politics and then somehow more trustworthy. Early in his run for Republican nominee, he told voters why vote for the other candidates who are just having their strings pulled by corporate interests. Basically saying, you could vote for me, I'm the guy pulling the strings. He then named several candidates live on air who had received campaign donations from him, and then all of those people, rather than like, fuck off, I don't need your money, they all proceeded to beg him live on air, saying how much they'd missed his money and how much they needed his donations. But of course Hillary Clinton is on this list as well, of campaign donations. So after receiving a donation from him, she attended his wedding and took several photos with Trump. Trump said of the wedding that Hillary Clinton, I said be at my wedding, and she came to my wedding because she had no choice. I'd given to her foundation. So shortly after Trump made this comment, the Clinton communications director told reporters that the comments bothered Clinton. And you might wonder sort of why they bothered her. Is it because it makes her look like a disgusting hypocrite, or that she was pictured with a vile racist, or that it makes the whole sham of like the Democrats and the Republicans are somehow different? Complete bullshit. No. What the communications director said is that it hurt her feelings, I'm sure, for him to suggest that he didn't want her there just for her company. It's pretty crap. So clearly, the spectre of Trumpism, or a much more alarming phrase, Trumpageddon, has clearly stalked the political scene in both major political factions for a long time now. But that's my point. Trump is no outlier at all. He represents the trend in US politics, particularly that of the Republican Party, albeit a more extreme version of that trend. For example, he wants to lower taxes for the rich. Trump wants a flat corporate tax rate of 15%, which would make it one of the lowest in the world. And currently the US has a tax rate of 40%. So this is mixed with this populist rhetoric that small businesses should also only pay 15% tax, and those whose income is 25 grand or less a year don't pay tax, but instead get a gold leaf form from the IRS telling them that they won. So it's very Trump. Yeah. Obviously, this means only a saving of a few $100s for the poor, but would mean multi-billions for the rich. So, along with making the rich richer, Trump wants more aggression in the Middle East, saying he would bomb the crap out of them. And it's this kind of rhetoric, along with bombastic verbal attacks on immigrants and Muslims, which has really separated him from the pack and has made him wildly popular amongst far-right groups, including Nazis and the KKK. Members of the KKK, as I've said, have attended his rallies at Alabama. At Alabama, there was a white power salute as well, given in the audience. And they have been very active on social media promoting Trump's views. Now, while Trump isn't a Nazi himself, probably, Nazis are making... it's being recorded, so I don't want people to look back at it as like, oh, he's wrong. Nazis are making use of this Trump as a charismatic leader to make their views more mainstream and to recruit. Now, this is what makes Trump incredibly dangerous, that he opens up this kind of space. However, this is not the source of his mainstream popularity. If white supremacist policies were, then we would be talking about a hopelessly racist America, which would basically be beyond saving. Now, while these are certainly major elements to his politics, they are not the driving force of the popularity. People like Trump because he talks about jobs and the economy. Trump supporters come from areas of deindustrialization and despair, wrought from years of Washington's neoliberalism, where jobs have evaporated and small businesses are in decline. So extreme has rampant neoliberalism been in these poor white areas that they have actually lowered the life expectancy. The new leading causes of death are suicide, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, and liver failure. So that's how extreme it is in some of these areas. And for the base of the Republicans in these areas, the middle class, a position that's normally saved them from the worst of capitalism, now it no longer protects them at all. And they are being thrown into poverty and insecurity. People at Trump rallies, when interviewed about why they liked Trump, reported that they liked his straight-talking attitude. And as far as the mayor concerns went, they were naturally began with the economy and employment, immigration coming in at a distant third. So I'd like you to sort of think back to that poll I talked about in Australia, that there's the main issues for these people, these desperate people, are still the economy and jobs. So, as Karen Nussbaum, who ran the survey, concluded, people are much more frightened than they are bigoted. So people can be whipped up into fearing Muslims or immigrants, but it's really their real lived reality that drives them there. It's this terrible fear of joblessness. It's this terrible fear that the middle class have, that they're going to be swallowed up. and the middle class in America particularly being soaked in Republican racism throughout the Obama years only confirms their fears that minorities might be trying to steal the country away from them. Trumpism then is this twisted and disgusting expression of the failure of neoliberalism, which is impoverishing forgotten workers and has made the middle class terrified and angry, as they are desperate not to lose their position in society. Of course, this does not mean that we stop condemning Trump or his supporters, but we have to recognise the desperation which is pushing people towards him. Not that they are uneducated, which liberals will usually assert themselves often the purveyors of racism, but a real and desperate desire to see the end of crisis and the dull terror of business as usual. Trump is unlikely to win the presidency, it should be said, however. In a head-to-head with Bernie Sanders, who talks about inequality and things like that, Trump would lose massively. So Trump is unlikely to win the presidency. He is far too buffoonish for the US establishment and business elites, and far too antagonistic to US allies. You could imagine the stress it would put on American foreign relations if bans on Muslim immigrations were actually passed. That would affect more than 1 billion people. And this is not to mention Trump's hostility to China and Mexico, both major US trading partners. Trump then, I would say, is a lot like Pauline Hanson. The Australian, we all remember her, the Australian bigot who whipped up fears of an Asian invasion. So she came in moving politics far more to the extreme right and in far more racist direction. Although she was later dumped from Australian politics, she had left her racist influence behind, which was gleefully adopted by Howard, who went on to tighten the noose on refugees and talk up fears of Asian immigration. So too, I think Trumpism will linger. Hillary, who seems to be more like the capitalists' anointed, is already banking on this. Not only does it help bolster the Democratic argument that she is the lesser evil, David Plouffe, an ex-Democratic advisor, commented that Hillary's campaign was already positioning itself to sweep up moderate Republican voters worried about Trump and Cruz. Plouffe described Clinton's campaign run as hope and change, not so much. More like hatred and castration. Clinton would do nothing to ameliorate extreme neoliberalism in America. She would definitely continue it, with tax breaks to the rich, imperialism in the Middle East, and much more, and more racism. She has clearly been a firm member of the establishment for ages, voting for war as Secretary of State, and boasts about kicking people off welfare. They're just a couple of their crimes, and I don't have the time to go into all of them, but they should certainly come up in the discussion. So then Trump's bid for the White House will likely fail, but Hillary Clinton will likely thank her lucky stars for him leaving so much garbage at the front door, because it'll make all of her shit smell that much sweeter. So as we've gone through, the political establishment in Australia and in the US is in crisis. Both governments have heavily relied on racism as a distraction and to scapegoat for their rotten policies and for the rich's naked profiteering. The major difference between official politics and the far right, your Hillarys and your Trumps, the Liberals and Reclaim Australia, is that the far right are racist amateurs. Far too crass for official politics, they are constantly derided in the liberal media, although secretly, of course, thanked for the good ratings that they produce. Trump is a loudmouth buffoon, more suitable for reality TV than he is for the Oval Office. Reclaimers, morons, who can't spell to save their life. What is seldom criticised by the liberal press is the group's actual racism and the origins of that racism. A really good example of this is from Waleed Ali's speech on The Project, if people remember, when he condemned the Islamophobia of Reclaim Australia, saying that it only aided terrorist organisations' othering of Muslims, and that the best way to defeat terror organisations would be to give up racism and for all of us to unite. However, in this speech, which was wildly popular, he never made one mention of the government's racism towards asylum seekers, leaving a major ideological plank of the fascists completely untouched, as well as the Liberal Party, who are the ones actually perpetrating the violence. This is, while reclaimers are on the street making noise, wondering if they're victims of white genocide because their toothpaste is halal. Meanwhile, Liberals are actually getting away with, murder. Yeah, so, but on top of this, Reclaimers have also been given a free platform at times. Think only of the generous half-hour slot given to them by Channel 7, where they were allowed to basically spew their bile everywhere without any criticism at all. And they were then given generously the veneer of concerned mums and dads. Even furious Führer Blair Cottrell gave the piece his approval, saying it was as good as Goebbels, or something like that, you know. He gave the piece his approval. But smaller liberals themselves can be just as frothing at the mouth of racist. Recently in The Age, which is typically seen as being more left-wing, published this article from John Sylvester on the recent riot in Melbourne. And it's worth reading a section out because I think it really shows how far beyond the pale these people can become. So, there were claims that the police were pulling over and questioning kids because of the colour of their skin, not because they were suspected of any particular crime. And so the police are reticent to talk about the problem of ethnic-based gangs for fear of being labelled racist. And so just going out of their quote, as an aside, are cops really worried about being called racist? They seem to work so hard for the title. So back to Sylvester. But there is the problem. The police in the southern region, the number of car thefts are record high, and the mostly Sudanese Apex gang is largely responsible. They have committed a series of run-on raids on houses and left residents terrified. So how do we respond? Take the gang leaders out of their comfort zone, pull them over, question them, search them, seize their drugs, and disrupt their gatherings. If they drive, pull them over anyway. If they use social media, change the laws so we can seize their phones and computers. And if they are 18 or above and they are not Australians, deport them. At the present, there are 1,000 serious crooks on this list to be chucked out. So why not straight hoods as well? So yeah, that's from a liberal paper, and it's just like this outright racism. So this guy isn't, of course, just for racial profiling. He's also for deporting black people. So yeah. So yeah, back to the United States. Trump's media presence has been obviously much more staggering. We probably all get updates about the latest thing that he said all the time. And usually these rants pass without much criticism at all. The media normally hiding behind neutrality as their excuse. Of course, this only causes politics to drift further and further to the right and can make extremely racist views seem more legitimate. So now, although Reclaim and Trump and other forces are the spawns of the current system, this does not mean that they are embraced by loving arms by the capitalist class. For the American establishment, as we said, Trump isn't their guy. He's seen as a bit of an embarrassment and making other countries uneasy. For the Liberals back here, both small and big L, Reclaim are a bunch of moronic thugs that just make Australia look unsafe for tourists. The far right, in both cases, can make the government's racist policies look illegitimate when they are associated with these loons. However, if the crisis were ever to deepen beyond the control of the ruling classes, they are more than willing to use these thugs as a battering ram against workers who are hungry for change, and to absolutely horrific consequence. We only need to look at Hitler and the Nazis, Mussolini's black shirts, Franco's fascist forces, to see the horrific examples and the horrors of fascism and the lengths that the ruling class are willing to go to hold on to power. Now that the system continues into crisis with no end, there seems that the major political parties seems to offer no credible solutions, and a vacuum has been formed. But politics, like nature, hates a vacuum, and vacuums must be filled. Now this can be done by the left or the right. You need only look at the success of Bernie Sanders in the US, that his rhetoric actually targets the rich and the inequalities in the system has gained him unprecedented support. Particularly amazing when you consider that he self-identifies as a socialist in the most anti-communist country in the world. But unfortunately for our side, the earth has been well tilled for the far right by racist government policies and of more than a complicit media. And this has led to the rapid growth and the attention paid to the far right. And that's why it's up to people like us to send these fuckers back. We must confront them wherever they show up to spread their filth. It has then been immensely encouraging to see large protests shutting down Trump rallies all across the country. And this will no doubt continue. Confrontations with bigots like Trump and his band of fascist followers blasts away any reputation they may try to cultivate of being respectable, and will help break away Trump's softer supporters who may even flirt with fascism. It is exactly the same approach that we have had to Reclaim Australia here. We will absolutely never allow them to have these peaceful rallies where they call for the death or expulsion of Muslims. Their rallies are not democratic expressions, they are displays of thuggery designed to intimidate their targets. Thuggery is how they spread their influence. By confronting them, we embolden the oppressed and we unmask the fascists for the monstrous ideology that they represent. Reclaim now, fortunately, is almost totally smashed, with only a few unhinged, jabbering Hitlerites clinging on desperately, its softer layer evaporating and splitting constantly all the time. Even most of its leadership have disappeared. So confrontation, frustrating the fascists, has been the best way of defeating them. So as we acknowledged throughout this talk, the people attracted to the arguments of the far right are usually those trampled on by capitalism the most, particularly the middle class without organisations like unions to rely upon. The ideology of the far right can seem like a log in a vast ocean for these individuals to cling to. Knowing this, we must offer a real and credible alternative to crisis, a left-wing one. We do not, as socialists, fall into the trap, as Nietzsche warned, he who fights monsters should be careful of becoming a monster, and if you gaze into the abyss long enough, you must be careful because it will gaze into thee. Like the dupes of the fascists, they are brutalised by the system, but then, rather than challenging it in any serious way, become its most brutal enforcers, its worst tormentors, meting out the cruelty they received tenfold on the desperate. The human dust, as Trotsky called them, crushed by the system, and then without the anchor of being a worker, with traditions of solidarity, blow wherever the ruling class tell them to. Utterly subject to their ideology and incapable of creating a new one. This is the horror we must fight vigorously. The world is truly divided between socialism and barbarism. And this isn't meant to terrify. The ruling class, it's meant to bring hope, because a new world, a socialist world, is actually possible. The capitalists will use the monsters of racism to enforce the status quo, and fascists to try and crush a new world. But that is why we must fight back. We must fight for a socialist world. Thank you.